Hello, and welcome to another season of the Storied Arcs podcast. I am your co-host, Mike.
And I'm your co-host, Alex.
And here we continue our usual style of doing a deep dive into indie and creator-owned comics. And this week we are getting you ready for the book Gospel by Will Morris, and Will Morris.
Yes.
Covers by Ver.
Covers by Ver, yes. We got a book here from Image. We're one person in charge of everything, which I guess is referred to as cartooning. You know, if you're writing, drawing, lettering, doing all that stuff, he's a cartoonist, not just a writer or an artist or whatnot.
And he pushes it a little farther than Jeff Lemire does, because it was almost cartooning when we did Underwater Welder, but he didn't do his own letters.
Yeah, he doesn't do his own. Well, Lemire doesn't do his own lettering, and depending on the book, he does or may not do his own colors. You know, if it's something like Underwater Welder, where it's effectively black and white, I think maybe Fish Flies, his current book, he may color, because a lot of times
watercolored, he probably did it.
Yeah, well, and a lot of his stuff is very minimal color palette anyway. But something like Sweet Tooth or whatnot, I think he had coloring help on that.
Oh yeah,
but yeah, he doesn't do his own lettering. I think Steve Wands is his letterer there. But yeah, here on this book, Gospel, Will Morris did everything. So I guess before we get into synopsis real quick here, Gospel is a book from Image. It's 5 issues from November 2022 to March 2023. So again, a relatively recent book in terms of our time of recording right now. And the trade collection just came out in June 2023. So only a few months back from where we are in terms of recording and when you'll be listening, if you're listening along live. So again, it's a recent book that just came out. It kind of came and went, I think, and I think maybe we'll talk a little bit about why, in terms of why it maybe doesn't have a larger footprint or just kind of a larger impact on the comics world. It's probably not a book that most people, even engaged comic readers, have probably heard of. From a creator they probably haven't heard of.
With definitely a creator they haven't heard of.
Yeah. I don't know about definitely.
To me, it's a stretch for someone in the States.
Yeah,
someone in the States, I think, it's very unlikely to have encountered Will Morris before this book.
Yeah. Definitely.
Or at least they wouldn't have known they encountered him. So,
which is my situation that I'm in. So, I do
think like Image has fanboys like me, and anytime I see an Image #1 popping up, I will click on look at the solicit and say, does this look interesting to me or not? Just because they're one of those publishers that I find that I'm usually in line with what they choose to publish.
Well, yeah, and
I'm like a little less that way with like Dark Horse. Like, I like plenty of Dark Horse books, but it's not nearly as automatic for me as Image.
Well, I think Image of the last several years has cultivated that reputation of there's always this air of this could be the next big thing. You never know. Sure. This could be the one. Obviously, the vast majority of them aren't, but there's still the idea that you're probably going to read something that is unexpected to you from a creator you probably never heard of. It may hit, it may not. It's not going to hit big. Not everything can be Saga. Not everything can be Walking Dead. The number of books that have been that died on the vine being called the next Saga is long and full of a lot of really good books. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah. And just because something fails.
Not Saga. Yeah.
Right.
There's not
you
Saga.
And I have a whole short list of books that didn't make it to the end. They were on Image and we love them and would talk about them. And in fact, I know we've got one on the schedule for next year.
Well, yeah, I think Image is like that, and I think that I don't want to say some of that shine is off Image. I think there's still the idea that there's that fear of missing out. So you want to get on the ground floor with an Image #1 just in case. Vertigo was that way back in the day. I think in a lot of ways, Boom has started to move on up, especially depending on who the creators are, since they're working with a lot of more established creators as opposed to breaking some newer people, some newer creators before they've made a name for themselves. Their Boom is now hosting a lot of well-established creators with their creator-owned work. So it's starting to shift a little bit there, but there is.
I think
Boom
is basically the last stop before Substack. It's like, if
Yeah.
you're someone who wants to keep all the money yourself and you're going to go online, give us a shot at Boom first. Like, we'll print your book, we'll distribute it.
Well, I said I don't know what the specific deals are, but I mean, you know, there are creators who have creator-owned books at a number of different publishers, and again, for whatever reason, in terms of what the relationships are, what those deals are like, but there still is a mystique around getting that number one, getting that first printing of a number one of a new series.
I mean, and especially in this case, when the cover looks like this.
Well, that is true. When a book stands out like this,
because it's such a clean cover, you know, I just love the line work on it. I love the coloring on it.
So is that why we've talked about here? Is that why? Because this is the book that you put forward for us to talk about.
And it's 100% why I picked it up.
It was a book that I was not familiar with, that I don't even really recall seeing. Like when I saw the covers there, it wasn't a book that I even recalled seeing, like on the solicitations or on the shelves or whatnot. So
I think I placed an order for it about a year ago. Like when I saw it on the solicit a couple months before it was released.
That's about right. Yeah.
All I saw was the elevator pitch and the front cover, and I was like, yeah, like $2.99, $3.99, whatever the single issue was. I was like, I'll take a shot at that. Yeah. And I'm not a big fantasy guy, and this book struck me as fantasy. Image calls it fantasy. Will Morris calls it fantasy. I'm not sure I would call it fantasy. It has a fantasy vibes, but
it does.
It's certainly not high fantasy.
But then it has fantasy vibes, but it goes out of its way to set it in a very ultra specific time period and place. You know.
Right.
Like that. That's a critical part of the story.
We'll probably talk about this in the actual discussion of the book, but I'm not particularly enamored with that time period or location. And it gets plenty of spotlight on its own.
Yeah, obviously.
So,
but not in this way, though. Not in the angle that Morris came at it from. But still,
not with a young female protagonist. Who I might as well read the synopsis.
Might as well, yeah, go through
it. So here's the synopsis for Gospel, and I apologize for any stumbling I do. Someone at the Image web development team does not know how to use commas. So here it is. When opportunity refuses to knock for restless hero Matilda, the devil comes knocking instead. Thrust into action by the hellish arrival, Matilda and storyteller Pitt will quest for renown, the soul of their community, and answers to the toughest question of all: who am I? Inspired by the work of Hayao Miyazaki and set in the chaos of King Henry VIII's reign, Gospel is a thrilling adventure that explores the truth behind the stories we tell. By the way, all of that was 3 sentences, no commas.
Yeah. Well, it's very Christopher Walken-esque there. Just
I know.
Pick your own spot. Yeah. But no, I think so. I think what's interesting about that is I read that, like when you mentioned this book and I read that pitch, like I was in. Like those are the kind of things that appeal to me. And so I was a little shocked to go back and kind of think like, well, where was I in the fall of 2022 when, like, how did I miss this one? Why did I not even give this one a shot? And it just, you know, there's a lot of comics come out. I guess I chalk it up as a miss, but you know,
it's a lot about the shop you go to. I mean, if it's true, like, if you were in there also, and someone was standing there holding it and you say, "Oh, what is that?" Otherwise, you know, I mean, you have a massive pull list.
I do. Well, saying,
I don't think you're making a lot of impulse grabs off the wall.
Well, I know I still do make a lot, but I'm saying, even without that, you know, our shop is very good about you know, displaying new comics and things like that. But like, I read the solicits when they come out. So like I'm the person that tracks solicits 3 months out. So this book issue 1 came out November 2022. So that means August 2022, those solicitations are out. And so I would have seen it. I would have read it. I assume I would have seen it. I would have seen the solicit. I would have read it, and I would have made a choice to pass on it, which is interesting to me. Curious to me, I guess, because the things that they talk about there, the idea, and specifically again, that idea of like the meaning behind the stories that we tell, and it's a reoccurring theme on things that you and I have talked about here, and a lot of the books that I like to read is this idea of the meaning of story, the power of storytelling, the way that stories influence the world, and all that is a theme that I like to go back to, and gospel falls right into that. And it was just looking back on it, it was just a mystery to me at the time.
Yeah, and ultimately, those themes are bigger than that. Because what it says here is, when opportunity refuses to knock for a restless hero, Matilda, the devil comes knocking instead. Well, thrust into action, storyteller pit, and it's like those are kind of like
that's
almost
the plot.
Ornamental, right?
That's the plot. That's the actual events of the panel to panel, page to page kind of thing. So that's not wrong there. But what the book is about, the larger thing that I think we'll get into a lot more next week when we get into our discussion, is this idea of what storytelling is, the meaning of it, why we tell the stories that we tell, why it's important to tell stories, because those are questions that are brought up by the characters in the story, by Matilda, by Pig. Because again, Matilda is a character who longs to be in stories. She wants to be known and renowned in stories, and Pitt is someone whose literal job is to tell stories.
Right.
That
should be a match made in heaven, right?
Yeah. But so we have these two characters that, in their own way, are obsessed or like purposely focused on stories and the telling of stories, and they both understand what the meaning of and the weight that they carry. And so, these are ideas that are explored. But what Image is saying is like, here's what it's about, which is like, the devil comes to this town to try to save it. And it's wrapped in this idea of the English Reformation around
King Henry VIII.
Yeah.
So, and I think it's interesting. I never caught this or didn't recall it from the solicit, that there's a little shout out to Miyazaki in there, and I do think it has slight manga overtone.
Well, I think there is Miyazaki. I think is I think a little reference to some of the style that Will Morris has.
And I think that's what I mean. First of all, a character with blue hair. A little more common in manga.
Well, but I mean, he has a very clean and very very simple style. It's very uncluttered. A lot of simple shapes. I think he's got a great design, a great art style. So I can kind of see how that is there. And then there's also this little bit idea of kind of magical realism.
Yes.
That Miyazaki has. Again, we talked about, is this fantasy or not? There are some like fantasy-ish elements that you maybe, as you're reading it, you're wondering like, did that really happen? Is that really what's there? Or is it this idea of, we're telling the story, and so that's why it appears, because again, it takes place in a specific time and a specific place, which is supposed to be our world, a world without magic. But there are these elements throughout gospel that maybe you're like, well, is there a little bit of magic here? Is there something else going on? A little touch of the supernatural. And I think that plays into that kind of Miyazaki comp there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as far as like publisher pitches go, not bad.
Not bad.
We've certainly seen worse.
Yeah. There
are some times where it's like, did they have like 30 seconds to get this solicit out, and they just skimmed the book as quick as possible, and they were like, yeah, it looks like this. So they at least had a grip on the plot, if not, the larger substance.
Yeah, they hit on at the end there with the idea of focusing on the stories that we tell, which is, again, that's the big theme, the capital T theme. Yeah.
And I think we have different comps for this. I liken it to Big Fish, the Tim Burton movie with Ewan McGregor.
Yeah. And I went a little darker as I read it, and compared it to The Usual Suspects.
And fun fact, we will do a creator interview with Will Morris, and he will settle this debate for us,
which is fantastic. So looking forward to that in a couple of weeks there. But yeah, in the meantime,
who do you want to talk about first? You want to talk about the writer, or the penciler, or the inker, or the colorist?
Actually, you know what? You're joking. I know. Let's actually start with the covers. Let's start with Ver.
Okay.
Let's start with the covers.
The only one I didn't offer.
Yeah.
Okay,
Let's
so
start with Ver.
here's a great reason to buy issue number 1 is that in the back you get a little story. I mean, very short story, and you get to see the 4 options he was given for the first issue cover
that they gave Will Morris to see, and you can see and looking at them, I think they chose one that I think works. I think there's a scale issue there in terms of the size of the Beast and Matilda. Right. I think it really works.
It sets your expectation for what kind of story you're going to be in. That being said, that bottom left one with them standing on top of a rooftop and looking up the hill to see the burning, smoldering church is really, really beautiful. And
it's very evocative. It's very evocative.
I kind of want to email Ver and say, hey, if you didn't do anything with that, I'll take it. Like, I'll buy it from you.
Yeah.
Since you already made it.
That's a little, it's like bordering on kind of spoilery-ish for the issue, though, but,
Right. I mean, that being said, I don't want to give anything away. Having the oversized boar there, I think, is also a little misleading about the direction the story is going.
Okay, I think that's fair, but I think that's kind of maybe sort of the point. So,
sure.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That aligns with the character. Yeah.
You were mentioning that there's the little short story there in the back of the first issue about the covers here. Do you want to read that real quick?
Yeah.
What Moore said? Yeah.
So this is this is from Will Morris. He says, I was in the process of drawing the covers for Gospel when, at a Comic-Con in Edinburgh, I caught sight of Ver's work. There ended my efforts to draw the covers for Gospel. For this first issue, Ver shared 4 options. I wish we could have gone with all of them. The option Ver recommended, and that we chose to go with, has a very special kind of magic. Looming threat, graceful movement, subtle story details, and tumbling tumbling croissants. Is that what he says? And then he just says simply, I adore it. Yeah. And Ver, who's a resident of Edinburgh, they are working on their own original graphic novel right now, which I'm not sure how widely that will be available or who's going to publish it or anything like that. But we'll have links in our episode description and on the Gospel page on our website to where you can find things from Ver. And
follow their work and see what's out there. Yeah.
And according to Twitter/X, Polish immigrant currently living in Scotland, doing all of their work out of there. And the book they're working on, original graphic novel called The Wilder Court.
Yeah.
But you can go buy prints very affordably, and they are all stunning of some of Ver's work. I mean, under $10 for legitimately beautiful art.
They also don't have a ton of work, much like we'll get to with Will Morris. They don't have a ton of work on in the U.S. North American comic market. Maybe an issue here or a variant cover there or something like that. So the fact that they did these covers, and what I love about that story, that Will Morris's idea is that this is his book. He wrote it, drew it, colored it, lettered, did all of that. And he's going to do the covers too, because obviously he's an artist. And then he sees someone else's work and is like, nope, that's better for my book.
Rip.
There's
I think that's an incredible humility to that.
Exactly what I was going to say. There's a level of humility of saying, like, I've done all of this already, and the last thing I need is a cover to grab the audience. And nope, there's someone who can do it better. To kind of make that call, which I think is great. And the covers that Ver does they're awesome. They are really, really beautiful and gorgeous. So, but yeah, I hope whatever book they're working on is something that will be readily available, because I think that is sort of a theme with what they have and also what Will Morris has done, that a lot of the stuff, as I move towards kind of Will's CV here, so much of his stuff is independent, small press comics and artwork and all that over in the UK,
and US stuff is like isolated one shots, scatter shot.
It's very, very small. So he's been working for a long time. I said, if you go to his website and kind of see the stuff he's done, a lot of it's like Oxford Press and things like that, and things that I assume are pretty much only available over in the UK. But in 2013, he did a story in 2000 AD. 2000 AD is a long running British weekly sci-fi comic magazine, most notable for being the home of Judge Dredd. He had a story in there. He did the art for a story written by David Bailey. That name is important because a couple years later in 2015, they had the two of them, Bailey and Morris, did a story for the Vertigo quarterly anthology CMYK for the Black issue. Those issues, there were 4 issues, oversized. They were themed around the CMYK color printing scheme. Anyone who's familiar with the color printer, you probably know the letters CMYK, cyan, right, magenta, yellow, and key, which is black. And each of the issues had a bunch of short stories, and they were all themed in whatever way the creators wanted around that color. So you had cyan, you had magenta, you had yellow, and then you had black. And the story that Will Morris drew, that David Bailey wrote, was in the black issue, which was the final one. It's called Night of the Black Stant, and it's kind of a coming of age story about a tribe of warriors, of all women warriors, all female warriors, and it's kind of the coming of age ritual for the younger generation, kind of what they have to do to become a woman and become like a full member of the tribe. So and again, these are all the stories are I think they're all like 8, for the most part, like 8-page short stories. And so yeah, that was the story that they contributed to the Black issue. If you can find these Vertigo quarterlies, I highly recommend them. I think they're really great.
Let me just tell you the 2014 or 2014 Vertigo quarterly, which is what we're talking about here.
Yeah, they did. It's
the also collected in a trade for $20. Let me just read the lineup.
Oh yeah,
from Fabio Moon, Jock, James Tynion IV. Ever heard of him? Tony Atkins, Pete Milligan, Nathan Fox, Gerard Way, Jeff Lemire. I mean, this is like the most all-star. This is like the Team USA comic.
Yeah. Oh no!
If there was an Olympic comic writing quarterly event, this publication would have been it.
No, I said if you can find them, yeah. It came out in 2014. It started in 2014, but the 4th issue, the Black issue, technically came out in 2015. Again, they were quarterly, so they're every 3 months. But yeah, the Black issue was great. Lemire is in that issue. He wrote a story called Sweet Tooth Black. So it's a little short story in there. Probably the best story. Fabio, you mentioned Fabio Moon. He actually did. He's the only one.
Earlier one.
No. He actually did a 4-part story that spanned all 3 issues.
Oh, very cool.
And he was the only one to do that. So he wrote one story across all 4 that tied into all the themes of the colors. The rest of them are all unconnected short stories. But in the Black issue, there again with Lemire and with this Night of the Black Stant story that Will Morris and David Bailey did, is a story called Black Death in America, which was written by Tom King and art by the late great Jean-Paul Leon. It is the true story of Henry Johnson, who is a Black U.S. soldier in World War I, who was a hero over there, only to come back after the war, post World War I, and face just obviously rampant racism. And he died in poverty in like the late 1930s, I think, maybe like 10, 15 years after he came back from the war. It wasn't until 2015, right before, or basically after after this story had been written, but before it had been published, basically, Henry Johnson was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, nearly 100 years after he had passed. But Black Death in America tells that story. And I believe it's the first time that Tom King had been nominated for an Eisner. He didn't win this year for Best Short Story, but if you can find that issue, the Black issue, find all of them. They're great.
Yeah.
But the Black stories, the stories from that 4th book, which include Will Morris's and David Bailey's, is I think that's the highlight. Probably, I don't know if it made sense that way, but given that it was the 4th color, it was the last one, you end on a big high note. That 4th volume is really, really good. So, but again, that was 2015 in Will Morris's career. So he's doing other stuff in the UK, whatever it is there. And then we fast forward to 2023. Where obviously 2022 is when he starts doing Gospel, and does the 5 issues, and the trade comes out. And kind of interesting timing, the trade for Gospel came out in June 2023, as I mentioned, and on that same day, an issue of Time Before Time came out, another Image book, which is written by Declan Shalvey and Roy McConville. It's a long ongoing series.
I was going to say, it seems like a book that might get covered here when it wraps, but it's going and going.
Yeah, well, I think it wraps up here before the end of the year. But back in June, issue 24, Will Morris guested on that. He did the guest art and he did the variant cover art. And that issue, Time Before Time 24, came out on the same day as the trade for Gospel. Like they were in stores on the same day. So think maybe that was probably planned that way. I don't really know, but
I mean, who knows? You have an 8-year gap in publishing in the States, and then you have 2 drop on the same whatever.
But they're both on Image. They're so at this point, he's working with similar people. But yeah, he came in and did a one-shot to guest on this story. That has been ongoing. But like that's pretty much it in terms of the stuff that you could fairly easily get and obtain and read here, for us in the US/North American comic market. There really isn't much there. I guess unless you were like trying to buy stuff directly from his website. But there's that story in 2000 AD, which is back in 2013. There is the Vertigo Quarterly in the Black issue. And then there's that issue of Time Before Time.
I'm issue so 24. Determined to get my hands on this Vertigo Quarterly now.
Oh yeah, you said,
and it seems like the type of book that during the Gold and Silver Age people loved. That when you could, you pay an extra nickel more and you get a bunch of stories from a bunch of art creators and artists. Yeah, and now people, they don't buy. I know they're using the term again, but they don't buy. Like they don't make Marvel 2-in-1s or 3-in-1s.
No, well, yeah, and they don't really do
Brave and the Bolds. Yeah, that type of stuff.
Not in the way that the classic way where
team ups are anthologies.
Yeah, anthologies are. I mean, I love them. Vertigo has done it before. I think I've mentioned Vertigo Time Warp, that was a one shot where every short story was focused around the idea of time travel.
Lemire was in that one, right? And Damon Lindelof.
Lemire drew the story that David Lindelof wrote. Tom King was also in that one. Gail Simone was in that one, which I think was her first Vertigo work. So it is fun too, because you can go back and look at you see the names you read off, like, oh my God, look at all these great names. But then you have to remember when it was written, when it was printed, and you realize that some of these guys, like a guy like Tom King, hadn't broken yet.
No, what you realize is that the editors at Vertigo knew their stuff. Well, I mean, Karen Berger, right?
Because I think she would have still been there. This is late period Vertigo here. It's 2015, 2014, 2015. We're only a few years from Vertigo's actual end. But at that point, I mean, I think when specifically Tom King, when he was writing this book, I'm sure he probably already had Sheriff Babylon in the works there, and plus he had interned at Vertigo back in the day. And I think the way that someone like Will Morris gets in, specifically with David Bailey, is that David Bailey had a book at Vertigo called Red Thorn. So he was already working with them, and then this quarterly comes out, probably coming in with an idea, and then he goes back to someone he's worked with previously, which again, they had done that short story, whatever their contribution was to that issue of 2000 AD a couple years earlier. So that was the way for Will Morris to get into this, was most likely through the writer David Bailey, who was already working with Vertigo on something else. So it's just kind of how those tentacles reach out and bring someone in for him to show up in this collection, this anthology. So as you mentioned before, that's how I saw his art and not know who it was. I didn't know who it was.
Right.
You
knew the author you were reading, but. And I think
even then, I don't think I probably knew. I would have gone through. I would have read the credits. It said written by David Bailey, art by Will Morris, and it wouldn't have stuck with me because I wouldn't have seen their names anywhere else. I wouldn't have continued to see them. So when I go back to that and I read those stories again, it's still just, oh right, this is a story with the woman tribe. I remember the story, but I'm not connecting to the creators because I haven't seen their names anywhere else. Versus when you go back and you read this, you're like, oh, this was a Tom King story. Oh, this is a Sweet Tooth story that was in here. How about that? Oh, Fabio Moon did this story here. Like there are other connection points when you go back and you see some of those creators again.
Now, do you think every comic reader reads the credits like that? Because I got to say, I was very attached to writers prior to this podcast, and there were a few artists that would stand out to me. Mostly cover art, but when you read like Fractions Hawkeye, obviously, David Aja's name because the art is so distinct and it's such of a piece with that story. But, there were years where I read Batman and Flash comics and I couldn't have told you who the interior artist was from issue to issue.
And I think that's I'm not gonna shame you on that because I think there's a time when everyone kind of does that. But over the last maybe at least 10 some odd years, as I think I've gotten both older and wiser in reading, and read a more of a wider variety of things. I think especially the past like 10 years, I always read the credits. I want to know who's working on it.
What you're describing right now makes it a lot better value for a $4 issue, right? Rather than someone who like you read all the letters from the creators and you get to know the creators and you start to connect the dots. Like what else have they worked on?
Exactly.
And, one of the series that is coming up somewhere down the road for us, you a different artist on 3 different books, but same author. And you said, you know what? I think these are like kind of siblings. And we're going to be able to group those together. And, maybe big fans notice that stuff, but the average person in the shop, if they're not branded as together, are not going to pick up that connection.
And the average fan is always going to go to the writer because that is the way that comics have been talked about forever. When we talk about like, people will say Matt Fraction's Hawkeye, and then you go to Matt Fraction about that or any writer and they're like, no, that's not the case. If there's no artist, there is no comic. It is the two of them together. So, a rare case, someone like Will Morris, who's going to go and do his own book like that. He's going to touch every aspect of it. You see it sometimes with some artists, here and there, but
tell me how far an issue of Hawkeye with no human dialogue, only a dog would go without the artist.
Exactly.
How much credit can the writer take? Actually, quite a bit because
quite a bit. Yeah,
it was still very well written.
Yeah, you're still story and plotting, but that's
but that doesn't go anywhere without the art.
People still think about comics as a writer's medium, and again, I think 100% of writers I've talked to and interacted with. Either at a con or an interview or things like that, they absolutely 100% wholly reject that idea, and yet they're still reported that way. So no, I make an effort to read all of the credits, whether it's a something like that, a Vertigo anthology where there's a whole bunch of short stories in there. Because I want to go back and see and I want to identify and it's one of those things too that. Both like Marvel and DC do things like that where they do collections of like maybe a Pride collection or like a Black History Month or Asian history or Native. They do these collections, but they don't always have the credits. Depending on who the creators are, they don't always put the credits with the story that they're doing. It's just like 8 pages and sometimes there's full credit, sometimes there's not. So oftentimes I'm reading a story and then I got to flip back to the table of contents because I want to wait, who is doing this art? Because a lot of those books that DC and Marvel would do, they're trying to spotlight unknown talent, newer talent, know? And so I'm constantly flipping back and be like, okay, who is this artist there? Who is this writer? I don't know this person. And because I want to make that connection there. And I know that's probably on the rare side, but you do that. And if you can pay attention enough times, you're going to find someone like a Will Morris. Although if you had found him in that Vertigo anthology in 2015, you'd have waited a while before he showed back up on these shores again. But you would have been primed and ready when he did show up,
Yeah.
Because I said,
oh yeah.
I read it, but his name didn't stick with me because I didn't see anything else coming down the line from him. But there's still, I still want to try to make that attachment to the stories that I'm reading. I want to read those credits. And yeah, because then at least now though, I can go back and be like, well, I didn't remember this guy, but I have this issue. I remember reading this stuff and I remember his story,
I'm going to pick up the issue and pretend that I had it. But
it's you just try to find one that's a little more beat up, a little worn, that looks like you read it a bunch of times.
Yeah, Well, that and like no one will know. I always talk about like what's in my collection. Yeah, and I don't have anyone come over to my house and go through boxes and look at stuff with me. It's just for me.
Yeah. And also in your collection from 2015 doesn't necessarily mean you got it in 2015. Maybe you got it last week. Who knows? So
yes, exactly. Anyway, I highly recommend this book. I think I think $15 for the trade.
Is that what it is? I think so. Yeah.
I think it's an incredible read. Which $3-4 an issue. You save a little bit of money in the trade.
Yeah,
and it is not a spoiler to say that. Well, the only spoiler here is that I'm spoiling our volume 1 podcast that we've already recorded. And in it, we were both reading the single issues, even though I had the trade as well. There were a few small editorial changes, but one massive change. The final page of the book is quite different.
That's right. That's right.
Different.
That's right. Yeah.
Between issue 5 and the trade. And I'm not going to spoil it because I think you should get your hands on both. I think it's worth it, even if you just like buy the physical trade and then buy just issue 5 on Comixology or whatever and go to the last couple pages. And
which one should they read first? They should read the single issue first, right? Because that came out first.
Single issue came out first, yes. And the single issue gave us the ambiguity that we debated.
Yes,
on the podcast, which I think is somewhat mitigated. I think it's still open to debate and interpretation.
Yes. It's a little more definitive with the change that comes in the trade. So yeah, if you do pick up both, read the single issue first. And then maybe read that first and then listen to our discussion next week. Right. And then in between that and the following week we have the interview with Will Morris himself. Maybe then go through and reread it. Or just reread the end of the trade only and see what the difference is. But yeah, our discussion, you and I, Mike, was based on the single issue.
Yes, yeah. So read the single. Go, your shop will almost assuredly still have all 5 issues.
Maybe not. You never know. Depends on print run.
That's true.
Probably didn't get the biggest print run, so may not have a whole lot of copies there.
I was at one shop in our town, and I saw that they had at least one copy of each issue still.
You can probably find them. Yeah.
So you can probably find the single issue. I recommend you do that. If you say, you know what, I'm not spending $50 on each book like these guys do in single issue and trade, just get the trade from the library, get it from Hoopla, whatever. Own the single issues, read the trade, and see what you think. I mean, I think we land in a place and Will even registers an opinion on it, but ultimately it's one of those books where I think it says a lot about the reader, like how the last few pages really hits you.
I think even with Will rendering an opinion as the creator and writer, I still think there's some intentional ambiguity there. I think,
it can still hit you how it hits you, right?
Yes,
regardless of intention. Yeah, it's going to register a certain way.
The way that you take in and process the ending of the story is in fact it is immaterial of whatever his intent was. Because there's no right or wrong way. I love the way that you take it.
I love learning about authorial intention, and I treat it sacredly, but I don't let it be a limiting factor.
I agree. I know that's a healthy way to go. Definitely.
So anyway. Grab this book. I cannot believe how much nuance we had to give for a 5-issue one trade book.
I know, seriously.
But it's just amazing. And now I'm like, how many books have I failed to see little changes? Because he said Image approached him and said, is there anything you want to change before we put this in a trade? And he said, oh yeah, I want, I've got a whole list of things.
Well, I'm sure. I know. I know there are little things like maybe a lettering change. Because like
they're mostly small,
a typo or a coloring fix or thing like that. But here we are talking about a fairly substantial change. Fairly substantial.
Yeah. I will say, humble brag, I did suggest a lettering change in our podcast episode. I also suggested it in the interview, and he said, "Oh, that's good. If it goes to a second print, I'll ask for that." And I was like, "Does that give me a comic credit? I'm going to put myself on Comic Vine."
Maybe so. I was say we should say that this change is not it's a presentation change. There's nothing different.
No new information.
In terms of
right.
Yeah, it is in terms of kind of the same information being presented in a different way. So it's more of a focus shift, I guess. It isn't like a whole brand new different page. It's just the same information given to the reader in a little different manner. We don't try to spoil it, but we want to say that it is different, but it's not new, I guess, is what we're trying to say with what this trade ending is like. So, but go out and find it. It is a book. Knowing that when we discovered that the trade was different, going back and reading it a second time in that manner, I think really does have an effect. But I am glad though I read it in the single issue first and got that initial reaction to the end.
The initial ambiguity.
I'm glad I got that. And then it was informative though to go back and read the trade after the fact, knowing that there was a change at the end, a change that the author himself, the creator himself, had approved. So that's an interesting experience.
It's wild stuff. So anyway, thank you for listening. You can always find us at storiedarcs.com. You will find links to our Blue Sky and Threads and Instagram and Facebook and all of the social media that now manages us rather than the other way around. But storiedarcs.com, always the central place to find that. Grab a copy of Gospel, share it with a friend, share the podcast with a friend, and we will see you next week for the full discussion of Gospel by Will Morris.
Peace.